Hey guys, it's Cyze. I wanted to talk to you today about the more recent changes in 10.1 towards our Shadow Priest tier set bonuses and the talent. There has been some reshuffling of the talent and the tier set, and I thought it would help alleviate some people's fears surrounding how boring the original set was. So for those of you that don't know, our original tier set was based around consuming Shadowy Insight procs to cause Mind Blast to deal 60% increased damage, whilst generating 4 additional insanity. Alongside that, the fourth set being for every 400 insanity you spend, you would summon a Shadow Fiend or Mindbender for 5 seconds depending on the talents that you picked. The primary concern with these bonuses was that it felt mundane, it felt boring, it wasn't game changing, other than if you were perhaps to play Yosharaj, then you would be tracking the 400 insanity with a weak aura to know when you should be pulling your Mind Blasts or your Shadow Word Deaths. The new changes are that your 2 set bonus increases the chance for your Shadowy Insight to trigger by 25%, and when you consume said proc, it deals 30% increased damage and generates 4 additional insanity. So they've essentially increased the proc chance of Shadowy Insight, but cut the damage bonus in half. Still, nothing interesting, but at least you have increased chances to proc Shadowy Insight, which might help you feel like you have more Mind Blast to throw around, which will line up well with Psychic Link going into this patch, seeing as Mind Seer has been removed, giving you access to that much needed AoE burst damage to replace the feeling and the damage of Mind Seer. Now, your 4 set bonus has your Devouring Plague damage increased by 15%, and every 4 casts of Devouring Plague, it will increase the damage of your Shadowy Apparitions conjured within the next 10 seconds by 80%. Overall, it's quite nice to see the developers listening to the community feedback, and even though this doesn't directly impact how you play the spec, it does give you more talent options when it comes to talenting into apparitions and the surrounding talents, specifically Auspicious Spirits and Tormented Spirits leading into that Yogg-Saron. So, with tier sets out the way, I want to have a quick little talk about the talent build, looking at what kind of variety you can see yourself using coming forward. And we are finding ourselves looking at a very different talent tree. And especially if you haven't touched the PTR or checked any changes yet, and that's completely fine, I'll be doing a more in-depth dive of the changes to the talent tree in a separate video. This is specifically for those of you looking at what variety of build there might be going forward in terms of PV content, raiding the different damage profiles, Mythic Plus, Tyrannical weeks, Fortified weeks. We're going to be going over those builds today. So, just a disclaimer, I'll try and get through these as quickly as humanly possible, but we are looking at 5 different builds that I'm going to show you, and you might notice the changes are very minimal, but they do actually have a fairly decent impact on what damage profile you have. So let's jump in. First of all, we're going to be looking at the primarily single target focus build, which you might find useful for raid encounters, specifically going into Aberrus, the new raid. Here we have currently the highest simming single target build, where you're going to be talenting into Void Form, Yogg-Saron and Cthulhu. You can see we're picking up Surge of Insanity, which essentially was Mindflay Insanity, but it now affects Mind Spike to do increased damage, whilst generating 6 Insanity versus 4 with the original cast. This also leads into Mental Decay for the 10% damage amp to Mindflay and Mind Spike as well. It also increases the duration of your dots by 1 second with Mindflay and 2 seconds with Mind Spike. We do also want to briefly lead down to the left to collect Shadowy Insight. This is a go-to, you want your Mind Blast procs, and it's even nicer to make use of that 2 set and gain those instant casts Mind Blast procs alongside that. We then have the standard Ancient Madness into Mind Devourer to allow our Devouring Plague to cost no insanity and to deal an additional 20% damage, and also fully making use of the Auspicious Spirits, Tormented Mind and Yogg-Saron talent choices to buff our 4 set and to allow it to do maximum damage with Auspicious Spirits, still picking up that Cthulhu for the insanity generation and the passive damage that it does. Now, the second iteration of this single target focus build is predominantly the same, accept your talent out of Yogg-Saron and Void Touched for a Yusharaj build. And the differences in simulation craft with this at the moment, it's a matter of less than 200 DPS. For the vast majority of Shadow players, this won't matter, it's rather insignificant, and it could be ruled out as a blip or a mistake in the sims, as they're never fully accurate and they can't replicate what a raid encounter looks like. This means for those of you that still want to play with Inescapable Torment are still more than welcome to do so, although you will experience less insanity, as Void Touch does grant you the extra 50 maximum cap that you're going to be dropping for this build. So, moving on to the 2-target Cleave build. This has some minor tweaks where we're once again dropping Void Touched, and we aren't taking Insidious Ire, but instead we're going to be putting 2 points into Scream of the Void and picking up Idol and N'Zoth for that little bit of extra cleave onto the second target. Quite simple, but also quite effective, as when it reaches a certain amount of stacks, it's going to explode, and it's really nice, especially if the bosses or the ads are stacked. Before we go into the dungeon focus build, I do quickly want to show you a 4-target build, just for the purposes of some fights in Aberrus. They can be quite council style, where they regularly have 3 or 4 targets alive that you're able to dot and maintain the dots on throughout the entire encounter. For this build, we're going to be completely dropping Mind Spike and Mind Melt in favour of Shadow Crush and Whispering Shadows, where we're able to Shadow Crush up to 8 targets once again, applying Vampiric Touch. Ideally taking Void Eruption, but Dark Ascension isn't far behind if that is your preferred talent. Now, with dungeons, we are seeing sims pull ahead in regards to taking Cthulhu and N'Zoth as idols, as well as taking your Mind Spike, Mind Melt and Void Torrent. We are also taking Shadow Crush and Whispering Shadows in order to apply that Vampiric Touch to 8 targets, the usual Maddening Touch and Dark Evangelism in order to increase the damage of your dots by 2%, stacking up to 5 times, which is also a nice pick when you're looking at mass AoE and overall damage and looking at that dot focus damage build. There is also a variation of this build that allows you to specialise a bit more into single target damage whilst in Mythic Plus or out in the open world, perhaps looking more at those tyrannical weeks or any dungeons with relatively difficult mini bosses in with ridiculously high health because Blizzard loves putting them in. In this variation, you're going to be swapping both points out of Evangelism for Phantasmal Pathogen, which increases the damage done by your shadowy apparitions by 150% to those affected with your Devouring Plague. Once again, doing this will significantly increase your damage, especially when you finally get your hands onto that 4 set. With that, guys, that was just a quick little overview of the different builds that you might see yourself playing going into the next patch, as well as the changes to the tier set bonuses. As mentioned, I will be doing a bit more of a deep dive into the different talent selections and the changes to the talent trees, and that'll be coming out in the next few days. But for now, thank you for watching. I hope this was a little bit of insight into the different builds that you might use, you know, encouraging people to get onto the PTR and testings for themselves. But thank you for watching, and take care.